We are talking today with Geoffrey Stone. He is author of the book Perilous Times, Free Speech in Wartime, from the Sedition Act of 1798 to the War on Terrorism. Geoffrey, thanks for spending time with us today.
Delighted to be here.
Start out, if you would, and tell us what your motivation was in writing this book.
Well, the motivation basically was the sense that we have a long history of abusing civil liberties and free speech in particular in time of war, and not always learning the lessons of the past. And so part of what I wanted to do is to both make that information and that history accessible to American citizens, and also to think through what can we learn from the past experiences, and how can we avoid making the same mistakes in the future and in the present that we've made in the past.
All right, and we appear to have a fairly rich history in dealing with our First Amendment laws.
Yes, indeed we do. The paradigm, the core violation of the First Amendment is a law or a policy that punishes individuals for criticizing their government. Whatever else may be the case about the meaning of the First Amendment with respect to obscenity or commercial advertising, the one thing that's clear is that at the very core of the First Amendment is the right of individuals to criticize their own government on matters relating to public affairs and politics. And what's interesting is in American history, from the standpoint of the national government, we essentially never have adopted laws that prohibit individuals from criticizing government officials, government policies, government practices, except in wartime. And yet in wartime, we have almost without exception adopted laws that both restrict civil liberties in general and free speech in particular. And so one of the things that interested me very much in working on this project was why that's so. And it turns out, I think, that one of the key reasons why that's the case is that there's a deep paradox at the very core of how we think about free speech. On the one hand, in a self-governing society, in a democracy, if a person believes that we are fighting a war that is unjust or immoral, or that our leaders are not doing a good job of fighting the war, or our troops are inadequately equipped or inadequately trained, that one would want them to be able to express those issues so people could deliberate on it and make decisions about what policies we should follow and who our leaders should be. So from that standpoint, criticizing the nation's policy in wartime can be thought to be at the very height of American patriotism. On the other hand, it's also the case that that exact same dissent can readily be cast as disloyal. And this often puzzles civil libertarians. But in fact, it's quite predictable that this would be the case, because criticism of a war, while we are in the midst of one, not only has the effect of contributing to public debate and understanding and discourse domestically, but also, and at the same time, has the effect of strengthening the enemy. Because if, in fact, the enemy knows that we are divided and uncertain, and that we might lose the will to fight, or may decide simply to withdraw from the combat because we no longer think that war is wise or worthwhile, then that will clearly strengthen their resolve, encourage them to continue in the war, encourage them to be more aggressive in their attacks, in order to cause the United States domestically to respond to the war in a way that will serve their interests. And so the same statement, the same criticism of a war clearly looks in both of those directions. It can be a perfectly legitimate and indeed highly valuable and important way of making good decisions domestically in the United States, and at the same time can lend real aid and comfort to the enemy. And for those individuals who are committed to the war, who've decided that the war is right and that we should pursue it, and here I mean any war, I'm not talking about the current war on terrorism, then to have their fellow citizens criticizing that war is clearly infuriating, because their sense is that that criticism will encourage the enemy, strengthen the enemy, cost American lives, and therefore is disloyal and treasonable. And so the very fact of dissent in wartime, because it does look in both of these directions, inevitably creates this enormous pressure to suppress the dissent, which is seen as working directly inconsistently with the nation's interests.
Tell us about the Sedition Act of 1798 and how that came about. Was that really the beginning of the attacks on First Amendment speech?
Well, sure. The United States government, as we have come to know it, only came into existence a decade before, less than a decade before the Sedition Act of 1798. And the way the act came into existence was really the combination of two critical factors. First, there was a war raging in Europe at that time between the French and the English, and it was the English monarchy essentially fighting against the French Republic, and the two armies were locked in a life and death struggle. Within the United States, the second major development is that although the framers of the Constitution very much feared and opposed the ideas of faction or of political parties developing, they thought Americans would and should see themselves as individual Americans who would vote for candidates based on their individual qualifications, and the idea of creating parties was something they were very uneasy about. Nonetheless, within a matter of several years, political parties came into existence. The Federalist Party, which was most prominently represented by Washington, Adams, and Alexander Hamilton, was the dominant party at the time. Washington and Adams are the only two presidents the United States had known. They were both Federalists. The Congress was a Federalist majority, and all federal judges had been appointed by definition by Federalist presidents, because that's all we'd had. And the Federalists are, one might loosely think of them as somewhat analogous to modern-day Republicans. That is, they tended to be from the wealthier classes. They were more concerned with stability, both economically and politically, than they were with liberty or freedom. They were distrustful of democracy. They didn't have much confidence in the ability of the common man to contribute usefully to their own governance. And they were very much inclined to be supportive of the British. The Republicans, led by Jefferson and James Madison, were more representatives of the South, of the agrarian interests, of the common man, and very much inclined to think about the importance of liberty and democracy and freedom than of economic and political stability. So these two groups were very much at odds and had totally different visions for the future of the United States. They were deeply distrustful of one another, and they both feared for the future of the nation. And democracy, as we have come to know it, was an experiment. And they understood full well that it was an experiment, and they had no idea whether it would succeed or fail. And one of the things they feared most was exactly the development of these kind of fractious political parties that they feared would eventually divide the nation and cause it to splinter. And that was exactly what was happening. And the war in Europe inflamed all of this because the United States essentially tried to maintain a position of neutrality. It was a small new nation that didn't want to get involved in military actions with either England or France, but it wanted to maintain its commercial relationships with both. But it was impossible effectively to remain neutral because the English and French each wanted the United States to come in on their side. And eventually Adams signed a treaty with the English, joined the English side, and the French started more aggressively sinking American shipping that was headed to England. And so Adams finally came to Congress and basically stopped just short of seeking a declaration of war, but sought a larger military, larger army, larger navy, the freedom for American ships to sink French ships. And the Federalist Congress eagerly supported this and put the United States in a position where we're on the verge of war. This terrified the Republicans, who basically saw that by weighing in on the side of the British, that this was a step on the part of the Federalists to move the United States back towards monarchist and aristocratic tendencies and away from the Republican French. So in this context, with great suspicion, great fear, lots of fanfare, patriotic flags waving, the Federalists enacted the Alien Sedition Acts of 1798. And what those acts did, the Alien Act of 1798 authorized the President of the United States to detain and to deport any non-citizen who the President found to be a possible threat to the security of the nation. And he could do this without giving the non-citizen any right to a hearing, any right to know the evidence against him, any right to challenge the evidence against him. It was a unilateral power assigned to the President. The Sedition Act of 1798 made it a criminal offense for any person to criticize the President, the Congress, or the government of the United States with the intent to bring the government, the Congress, or the President into contempt or disrepute. arguments the Federalists made about these two pieces of legislation in defense of the laws was that they were necessary for the United States in wartime. That is, the Anti-Alien Act was designed to assure that French spies and saboteurs and traitors could be removed from the country quickly and with expedition. And the Sedition Act, they argued, was necessary because if the United States was going to be in a state of military conflict, that it needed unity, that the people had to have confidence in their leaders, and that any criticism of the administration or the leadership of the nation would have the effect of undermining that confidence. But the real rationale for these laws, in fact, had little to do with the impending military conflict, which never actually came to being, but rather to do with the effort of the Federalists to destroy the Republican Party. And these acts were designed to do that in two ways. The Alien Act was designed because most of the new immigrants to the United States, and this was a period of very high immigration, tended to become quickly aligned with the Republican Party. And this was a way to both get rid of some of those people and also to deter any additional immigrants from coming into the United States by being very inhospitable to them. And the Sedition Act was obviously meant as a way to prosecute any individuals who criticized the Adams administration. And in fact, the Sedition Act was aggressively used by Federalist prosecutors and Federalist judges exclusively against the Republicans, against Congressman Matthew Lyon, who was a representative from Vermont, who was put in jail for giving a speech critical of the Adams administration, and to all of the major editors of Republican newspapers. And the Federalist goal was to essentially cripple the Republicans with an eye towards the 1800 election so that Adams would be reelected and that the Federalists could maintain their dominance. As it turned out, the American people revolted against the Alien and Sedition Acts. They elected Thomas Jefferson in 1800. Jefferson then pardoned all of those who had been convicted under the Sedition Act. The Federalist Party essentially disappeared shortly after that. 50 years later, the Congress repaid all of the fines that had been paid under the Sedition Act, and in the year since, the Supreme Court has consistently declared the Sedition Act of 1798 unconstitutional. And part of the importance of the last part of that story is that the history is not only a continued repetition of abusing civil liberties and First Amendment rights in these various episodes of wartime throughout our history, but it's also interesting that after each episode, we recognize that we behaved badly and that we, with the benefit of hindsight, look back and say we should not have done that thing that we did and try to avoid doing it again in the future. But in fact, we have had only very limited success in learning the lessons of our own history because the pressures that wartime creates are so great that we frequently give way to them, even though we may know from past experience that we tend to give way to them too easily.
Are there other examples where laws like that were passed for political reasons instead of really protecting citizens?
Sure. The two other periods in American history where I think this was most dramatic, first were World War I. The United States and most citizens in the United States had no interest in becoming embroiled in the First World War. This was a European conflict. It was not seen as directly affecting any essential American interests. It raged in Europe with enormous casualties for several years before the United States got involved. And Woodrow Wilson was reelected president of the United States on the campaign platform that he kept us out of war. And that was one of the reasons why he was reelected. But by 1917, Wilson decided that the United States needed to enter the fray. And his reason for doing so is not because the United States had been attacked. It had not, in fact, been attacked, but rather because both the Germans on their side and the English and French on the other did not want America to be shipping munitions and armaments and other supplies to their enemy. And the English and French were able to achieve their goal fairly easily because Germany has very little access to the sea. And so what the English and French did was simply mine the various routes to Germany, for the sea lanes to Germany, and therefore American ships simply stayed out of those harbors and rivers. But for Germany, the situation was different. England and France have vast access to the sea, and so they couldn't use mining as a way to prevent the shipping, and so they used German submarine warfare. And they very clearly warned the United States that we do not want any neutrals shipping to the belligerents, particularly from the German side, the English and the French. Nonetheless, the United States continued to persist in its efforts to provide materials to the English and French, not so much because of any particular tie to the English and French in this war, but rather because this was commercially important. And Wilson finally decided to seek a declaration of war in 1917 on the ground that Germany was violating the international law and the international rights of the United States to freedom of the seas. And Wilson was right. In fact, non-belligerents do have a right under international law, for whatever that's worth, to trade with the belligerents. And they're not supposed to be attacked for doing so. Nonetheless, many Americans were very much and bitterly opposed for the United States entry into the war. And although the Wilson administration, once it made the decision to enter the war, tried to sell it as a war that was designed to make the world safe for democracy, many citizens saw this not with that as the goal, but rather the goal was to make the world safe for munitions manufacturers, armaments manufacturers, and those who were making a fortune on profiteering with the English and the French. And whether this was true or not, there was a large segment of the American people who had this view. So Wilson faced two problems. On the one hand, because we hadn't been attacked, it wasn't like Pearl Harbor, there was no event that rallied the American people to the defense of the nation, he needed to create an outraged public that would be emotionally committed to participating in the war and make the sacrifices that war demands, enlist, buy war bonds, and so on. And to do that, he created an organization called the Committee on Public Information, which was a propaganda arm of the federal government, led by a public relations man, which was charged with the responsibility of creating a flood of leaflets, movies, editorials, pamphlets, lectures, all designed to generate a hatred of all things German and to generate a suspicion of any type of disloyal or what might be perceived to be treasonable conduct within the United States. And the second thing Wilson needed to do was to suppress the criticism, because there was a large amount of opposition to the war, and because his hold on the majority was very tenuous, because people didn't feel we needed to be in the war in the first place, it was important to eliminate criticism. And so he got through Congress to enact first the Espionage Act of 1917 and then the Sedition Act of 1918. And what those laws essentially did was to make it a crime for any citizen, any person, to criticize the war or the draft throughout the entire World War I. And during the course of the war, some 2,000 individuals were prosecuted under the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. And whereas in the Sedition Act of 1798, the maximum penalty was 6 months in jail, during World War I, the penalty for violating these statutes was generally between 10 and 20 years in prison. And the act was applied broadly to virtually anyone who criticized the administration or the draft. So to give an example, on one end of the spectrum, at the most obscure end, there was a young 20-year-old woman named Molly Steimer, who was a Russian Jewish emigre, who threw leaflets from a rooftop on the Lower East Side of New York that opposed the United States' participation in the war. She was arrested and prosecuted and convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison for doing that, and was later deported from the United States. On the other end of the spectrum, there was Eugene Debs, who had been the Socialist Party candidate for president in 1912 and had received more than 1 million votes, 6% of the entire number of votes cast in the election for president of 1912. He was arrested for giving a speech in a speech in Ohio, in which he accused, by innuendo, the Wilson administration of restricting the freedom of speech. And for that, he was arrested, prosecuted, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. And that would be the analogy today of Howard Dean or John Kerry being criminally prosecuted for their opposition to the war in Iraq. What Eugene Debs did in 1917 was no different from what Howard Dean or John Kerry did in the 2004 election. So it's amazing that only 80 years ago, a major political figure who challenged the legitimacy of a war could go to jail for a 10-year prison term for doing nothing more than what we today take very much for granted. So for Wilson, to come back to your question, is this an example of manipulation to serve not the immediate war needs, but rather to serve a different need? He needed to suppress the dissent because he needed to manipulate American public opinion. And he needed to form American public opinion in such a way so as to support the war effort. And he needed to do that not just by persuading people, but also by silencing those who took a different point of view. And the other episode, which illustrates the same point but more aggressively, is the Cold War. After World War II and after the Soviet-American alliance that had been in place throughout the Second World War, when the United States and the Soviet Union became essentially enemies during the Cold War, a group of opportunistic Republican leaders having not been in office for 16 years during the Roosevelt and Truman era, saw an opportunity to use the fear of communism as a way to exploit and to exacerbate that fear so as to generate momentum for the Republican Party. And so what people like Joseph McCarthy in 1948 in Wisconsin and Richard Nixon in 1948 in California understood is that by playing the red card, by accusing tens of thousands of Americans of being disloyal, and by accusing the Democrats of failing to protect the nation against the infiltration of subversive elements, that they were able to generate fear and then say, you can't trust the Democrats to protect us against this fear. You have to trust us, the Republicans, because we're the ones who are out there campaigning against the infiltration, the espionage, the sabotage that could undermine American society. And so much of the Red Scare that occurred after World War II, which resulted in enormous numbers of individuals being blacklisted, being publicly humiliated, being criminally prosecuted, not because they were agents of the Soviet Union, not because they were engaged in espionage and sabotage, but because a decade or two earlier they had supported liberal causes that were identified later as connected in some way with the Communist Party or the Communist movement. The main goal that was being served through all of that was essentially to terrify the American people and to cause them to see the Republicans as their protectors and saviors. And it was effective.
Do you see any parallels to what happened then and what our current climate is now with the war on terror?
Well, certainly there are parallels. The first thing I want to emphasize, though, is that when people say, and one hears this not infrequently, that we're now in the midst of the worst onslaught against civil liberties in the history of the United States, that's poppycock. That the fact is that when you understand this history and you understand what the Sedition Act of 1798 did, and when you understand that during the Civil War, that Lincoln had 38,000 citizens detained with the suspension of habeas corpus by military tribunals, and that 120,000 people of Japanese descent were interned during World War II, and what we discussed about free speech in World War I and during the Cold War, the fact is that the degree of oppression or suppression at the present time cannot, in fact, be compared in the same breath with some of those prior episodes in terms of the magnitude of what's happened. That's an important fact to simply recognize. Second point to make, though, is that although that is a cause for congratulation, that we have, I think, developed as a society, a culture, and a legal system that is more attuned to this issue than was true in most of these past episodes, we shouldn't underestimate how vulnerable we are to the same tendencies that have so dramatically affected us in the past. Had there been 6 9/11s and not just one, this conversation would be entirely different. And the United States undoubtedly would have done many more severe and dramatic things than it has done thus far. So we need to be, as Justice Holmes once said, eternally vigilant about these matters, because in moments of fear and crises, it is easy to completely lose all sense of balance and to wildly overreact. Now, in terms of how to think about what we have done so far in this period of time, what I would say is that there has been, on one level, there has been some degree of exploitation politically of the situation by the administration. The notion that you need to trust us to protect you. The alerts that were being used for a while, which you notice have kind of disappeared now, but that were used for a while, were clearly, I think, used in a manipulative way to maintain a level of anxiety in the country. In part for legitimate reasons, and in part, I think, clearly for political reasons. And this administration is certainly not alone in having done that. But we should recognize that this is part of a pattern that has occurred other times in our history, and we should be skeptical of it. And we shouldn't automatically accept it's well-intentioned or legitimate. Second, the administration has taken steps that do really, and in some very significant ways, threaten our civil liberties, although in some instances they're much more subtle than the more draconian efforts that existed in 1798 or during World War I and during the Cold War. It's clear today in our culture and in our law that the government cannot criminally prosecute those who criticize it for its conduct of the war or the draft. or at least unless the situation presenting the United States is not far more of a crisis than we've faced thus far, that would be unthinkable. And if the administration had sought to enact legislation making it a crime for Howard Dean to criticize the president and the war, I would like to think the American people would have reacted explosively to that. And so that's simply totally incompatible with our current values. However, this administration, like others historically, have used other mechanisms that I think are designed to shape in important ways public debate. So one good example of this is the Bush administration has been more effective and more aggressive than any in American history at putting a damper on access to information about how the government itself is conducting itself. And it's very difficult to engage in effective criticism or dissent or understanding of the activities of one's own government if the government keeps secret from the media and from the American people what it's doing. So let me give you an example of one of many. After 9/11, the government detained 1,000 non-citizens in New York and New Jersey because some evidence they claim existed that these individuals might have had some connection, however remote, to terrorists. And they refused to identify, to this day, who those individuals were. So the American people were never allowed to know who these 1,000 people were, why they were detained, what the evidence was against them, what proceedings were brought against them, whether they were allowed to have any reasonable due process to defend themselves against whatever accusations were lodged against them, which we to this day don't know what they were. And then the government proceeded to deport the vast majority of these individuals in closed deportation proceedings. Closed deportation proceedings are virtually unheard of in American history. Ordinarily, deportation proceedings, like criminal trials, are open to the public and to the media. And that's an important part of how we keep our government accountable. The very fact that they have to do it out in the open, and they have to present the evidence to the public as well as to the jury or to the hearing officer. And in this instance, the government of the United States closed all of the deportation proceedings of the individuals who had been detained after 9/11, excluding the press, excluding members of the public, excluding even family members. So to this day, we have no idea of all those people who were deported, why they were deported, what they did, what kind of hearing they had, what the evidence was against them. And it's impossible for the American citizens to fulfill their responsibilities in a self-governing society to hold their leaders accountable when the government itself refuses to give them access to critical information. Now, the government always has some reasons to protect the confidentiality of information, and there are circumstances where it's totally legitimate for the government to maintain confidentiality of information. But the presumption should always be in favor of openness. And this administration, because it cannot directly restrict free speech, has instead, I think, tried to diffuse what might otherwise be criticism by simply making many of its actions either invisible or at least impenetrable to the press and to the public.
For those of you just tuning in, we are talking with Geoffrey Stone. He is author of Perilous Times, Free Speech in Wartime, from the Sedition Act of 1798 to the War on Terrorism. Can you give us a sense for how many of these laws stayed in place after they were brought about and how many were changed over time?
Well, again, when we say these laws, there's many different government actions that have contributed to the various episodes that I talk about. Some of them have been laws, like the Sedition Act. Some of them have been loyalty programs put in place by executive orders. Some of them have been simply practices like investigating and infiltrating political organizations that were engaged in by the FBI or the Justice Department. But to answer the question, as I said earlier, in most of these episodes, after the dust has settled, we have looked back and said, we behaved badly. And most of the time, therefore, after these episodes, we have either repealed the legislation, if there was legislation involved, or ended the practice, if there was a particular practice at issue, or eliminated the programs, like the loyalty programs that were put in place during the Cold War, or Supreme Court cases have overruled prior decisions of the Supreme Court that had upheld some of these activities then later looked back and said those decisions were wrong, these were violations of the Constitution. So on the whole, what we have done is to learn the lesson, at least in the sense of eliminating the law or the practice or the judicial decisions that enabled or implemented or approved the actions that we did in wartime. After World War II, with the internment of the Japanese Americans, the United States, of course, eventually freed all the individuals who'd been interned for as long as 3 years. But it took until 1988 before Congress enacted legislation, the Civil Rights Restoration Act, that the United States formally apologized for its admittedly unconstitutional conduct in that era and provided reparations. So there it took 45 years for the government to directly acknowledge the lawlessness under which it had acted. So it varies a lot from one circumstance to another. And sometimes the practices, unfortunately, are re-implemented. And a good example of that is throughout our history, in periods of wartime, one of the steps the government has tended to take and to abuse is the power to infiltrate and engage in surveillance of dissident organizations. And this was done during the period around 1798. It was certainly done during the Civil War. It was done during World War I and in the Red Scare right after World War I. And it was done most intensively in the years from the 1950s through the early 1970s, when the Federal Bureau of Investigation under J. Edgar Hoover, and particularly with the anti-Vietnam War movement, where it was no longer possible to prosecute people like Eugene McCarthy. So it became necessary to address issues more by indirection. And so what the FBI did was to enlist large numbers of spies and confidential informants who would become members of these organizations, who would see who attended lectures, who attended anti-war demonstrations, compiled dossiers on all of these individuals. And so that by the early 1970s, it turned out that the United States government had compiled files on more than 500,000 Americans because of their participation in one way or another in the anti-war movement. And of course, what the government did was not just compile dossiers, because once you compile dossiers, you might as well use them. Otherwise, there's no point. And so the way the government used these was to harass, to intimidate, to silence, and to disrupt individuals who were opposing its policy in Vietnam. So, for example, if someone was giving charitable contributions to a anti-war organization, the IRS would audit those individuals. If there was a member of a anti-war organization who was renting an apartment, the FBI might send a letter to the landlord saying, do you know that John Smith, who lives in your building, is a communist and is somebody who is calling for the overthrow of the government of the United States? Well, that landlord very quickly evicted the tenant. They would send letters to the universities at which individuals attended, informing them sometimes truthfully, sometimes falsely, that they were drug users, that they were drug sellers, that they were revolutionaries, and again, often got them expelled or suspended from their institutions. They would send letters to people within the movement. So you would get a letter saying that, it could be an anonymous letter, falsely stating that John Smith, who's a member of the organization, is embezzling funds from the local SCS chapter, or that John Smith, who's a member, is actually an FBI informant. And so that by doing this, they would create suspicion and distrust and division, and ultimately the point of this was to make it more difficult for those organizations who were protesting American policy to do so effectively. They would send letters announcing meetings when there was no meeting. So people would go to the meeting, nobody would show up, everybody would be disgruntled, and next time there really was a meeting, people didn't show up, because they didn't know whether the meeting call was real or not. So when all of this came to light in the early 1970s, the Congress held hearings and disclosed all of this to the American people and declared in committee reports that this was all unlawful and unconstitutional. And Attorney General Edward Levy in 1976, who was Gerald Ford's Attorney General, adopted guidelines that prohibited the federal government, the FBI in particular, from engaging in any surveillance or infiltration of any political or religious activities or organizations unless there was clear evidence that those organizations or activities involved criminal conduct. And for 25 years, the Levy guidelines stood us in very good stead, and so far as I am aware, the FBI and the Justice Department steered clear of seeking to engage in surveillance of political and religious activities, except in those circumstances when there was clear evidence of unlawful conduct. Attorney General Ashcroft in 2002 eliminated the Levy guidelines and essentially said that they are no longer appropriate for the war on terror, and thereby unleashed the FBI to be able to infiltrate and engage in surveillance of religious and political activities, even though there is no evidence to believe that any of those organizations are engaged in criminal conduct. So that's an instance where we saw the abuse, the determination that the abuse was an abuse, the determination to eliminate it, and then its return 25 years later in exactly the same form. And again, because of the secrecy of the administration, we have no idea to what extent they are or not using the authority that Attorney General Ashcroft released again to the federal government.
And do you have a sense for the subtle changes that have happened, especially looking at that it appears to me that our wars since World War II have been undeclared wars? It would seem that the subtle changes might be harder to address over the long haul than, let's say, the more obvious, like a Sedition Act type change.
Right. I think the change is less about declared versus undeclared war, which really is not a concept that has great significance legally. But it is rather about the subtlety of the way of addressing the issue. So one of the things that has tended to happen over time is that once it becomes clear that a particular measure is no longer politically or legally acceptable, like criminally punishing political leaders for opposing a war, then the government, because it is trying to both serve the national interest and oftentimes exploit the opportunity for political gain, and also nobody likes to be criticized. So it is human nature to want to suppress that kind of criticism. So the government then tries to use alternative means. So after it became clear, for example, that you could no longer criminally prosecute people for criticizing the government, in the Cold War, the government moved then towards legislative investigations that were designed to expose and humiliate people for their political activities, or blacklists. So you didn't criminally prosecute them, but you fired them and you put enormous pressure on other people not to hire them. And when those activities were eventually held unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, when they were done for the purposes of political retribution, then the government engaged in this kind of surveillance and infiltration as another more subtle step. And now there's also the effort on the part of the administration to control access to information by being obsessively secretive about the information in the hands of the government. So yes, there's good news and bad news. The good news is that the indirect and more subtle ways of affecting dissent are less efficient and less likely, clearly less likely to have as significant an impact as the more direct, it's a crime to criticize the government, and you're going to go to jail for 15 years if you do so. That's pretty effective. So by forcing the government to at least move to more subtle and less efficient mechanisms, it does produce a higher degree of freedom of expression than would otherwise exist. So again, we shouldn't lose track of the fact that merely by channeling the government's efforts into these less efficient, more indirect ways, a lot is accomplished. On the other hand, even these indirect ways can have a significant impact. And so let me give you an example of why that's important and why that's so. An important fact to understand about free speech is that very few individuals in the country rationally believe that they individually can have any impact on national policy. So whether I sign a petition or buy a book or attend a lecture or vote for a particular candidate or participate in a political demonstration as an individual is unlikely to affect what national policy will be. And if I know that somebody is keeping a list of who signs the petition or who participates in the demonstration or who attends the lecture, and that list might be going to the Department of Justice, which is creating dossiers about who those people were, then I know I'm exposed to some serious possibility that either immediately or sometime down the road, this will come back to haunt me. Maybe it will be disclosed to an employer or a prospective employer. Maybe it'll be disclosed to a landlord. Maybe it'll even be tied into some other information that leads me to be thought of as a suspect in some kind of a criminal activity. And since I have no real possibility individually of affecting national policy anyway, I will probably say, you know what, I think I'll skip that demonstration, or I think I won't sign that petition, or I won't attend that lecture, because I'm really not going to accomplish very much, and the danger to me of doing this is sufficient so that it's just not worth it. Now, the problem is, for the individual to make that decision is bad enough, but the cumulative effect of that on the entire construct of public discourse in the United States is profound, because of everyone who might be inclined to be skeptical about the government's policy makes the same individual decision, then 40% of the people, 60% of the people can be silenced, and the entire thought process of the nation becomes mutilated. And it's that fact which means that even though these are more subtle and less efficient ways of controlling public discourse, they should not be dismissed as unimportant. And when we look back to the Cold War period, where the government relied primarily on indirect ways of punishing and deterring people from exercising their First Amendment rights, the effect was profound. When we think back to that era of an era of conformity, of the man in the gray flannel suit, of the fear that people had of doing anything out of the ordinary or that would call attention to themselves, a lot of that was the extension of the fear of doing anything to wind up on somebody's list. And so the conformity of that era, which was not only political, but it became social and cultural as well, was in large part the result of the fear that people felt about simply not wanting to be seen as different. And that was achieved by indirect means. And so we shouldn't underestimate the importance of these measures. So when the police are out there, or the federal government are out there photographing people at an anti-war demonstration, what the government says is, what's the big deal? You're out in public, you're exposing what you're doing to anybody. A newspaper man can take your picture. An amateur photographer can take your picture. Why can't the FBI take your picture? And the answer is, if you know that a newspaper man is taking the picture or a stranger is taking the picture, then you know, well, maybe this could in some way get me in trouble, but the probability is pretty remote and I'm not going to worry much about it. But if you know that there's an FBI agent taking photographs, then that is the government doing it. And the effect of that on your willingness to participate in the demonstration is quite a bit higher. And so we should be very careful about trivializing the implications of these types of more subtle effects. So ultimately, you asked me, though, about how hard it is to get at these as a legal matter. And the answer is it's much harder to get at them. When someone's criminally prosecuted, you can set up as a defense to the prosecution that the government seeking to punish me for the exercise of my First Amendment rights. So there's an immediate interaction between the government and the citizen in a court of law, because that's where the prosecution takes place, and the legal issue is directly presented. When the government spies on people and secretly infiltrates organizations and doesn't tell you it's doing things to you, all you can do is be suspicious, and you can't bring a lawsuit because no one's actually done anything that you can prove to directly harm you. And so it becomes much more difficult to get a handle on these more subtle devices. And so courts have a much harder time of actually addressing on whether they are or are not constitutionally permissible. So one of the dangers of these subtle devices is that although they're more inefficient, they're also much more difficult to assess from a legal standpoint because they don't produce the same kind of direct confrontation between the citizen and the government.
Give us a sense for how we are faring currently with government suppression of other institutions beyond individuals, like, let's say, our press and institutions of higher learning.
There are lots of concerns both about the media and about higher education at the present time. In the world of higher education, the issue arises primarily in the sense of research in areas that the government has determined could have some relevance to national security issues, such as research into various biological agents, which can be used for medical purposes, but also can be abused for weapons purposes. And so one concern that one hears in higher education is that the government has intruded much more aggressively than it ever has before at least in the last 30 or 40 years, in terms of limiting and monitoring the types of research that can be done, because some forms of research can be turned to bad uses. There have been serious efforts by the government made to restrict access to certain types of research by individuals who are not American citizens or are citizens of certain defined other countries in a way that denies us access to some of the best scientists or prospective scientists in the world who always had free access before. There are areas of higher education simply in terms of the fear on the part of non-citizens entering the United States to study. So the percentage of non-citizens now studying in American universities is considerably lower than it was 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, which is very much the result of the government efforts to clamp down on that. Another recent phenomenon that affects higher education and publishing is that one of the more bizarre rules enacted by the administration is that the United States does not trade with some nations who it regards as subject to sanctions, such as Iran or Cuba. And so we are not allowed to import materials, products that are produced in those countries, because the sanction against the country for their misbehavior in international law is that we won't buy anything from you and we won't sell anything from you. So this has been applied, amazingly, even though a congressional statute prohibits it. It's been applied to a scholarship. So if a person in Iran writes a scholarly work on literature or on history, and an American journal wants to publish it, a scholarly journal, they are not permitted to edit it, because by editing it, they're seen as adding value, which is the equivalent of sending resources to Iran, and that's deemed to be a violation of American Treasury Department regulations. This has been challenged by a number of universities and by a number of authors, but that's an example of, in very insidious ways, where you would think that, you know, if someone sitting in Iran writes a book or writes an article that is of interest and importance to the American people, that shouldn't be treated like a product, like a rug that we're embargoing. And yet that's the way the Bush administration has interpreted the federal statute, even though the federal statute explicitly says that these embargoes cannot be applied to expressive materials. With respect to, you asked about higher education and you asked about?
Oh, the media.
Right, the media. With respect to the media, I think that there are a variety of dangers that have emerged. There are very mixed views about the product, about the notion of embedding journalists. There are many journalists who believe that this was a great thing for American journalism and that has given them access and knowledge and familiarity with the military in a way that journalists have never had before. And in some sense, I suspect that's true for the journalist. On the other hand, I rather suspect that the coverage we get as a result of the embedded journalist is much less independent than it would be if they were not embedded. And the way American journalists covered wars in the past was not by signing agreements with the military that gave the military authority to determine what those journalists could and couldn't do and what they could and couldn't broadcast. And the deal that the Bush administration offered was, we'll let you come with us, we'll let you stay in our units, you can travel with us into combat, not just get there on your own. But the deal is you then have to somewhat sell your soul. And the critical question is how much of the soul has been sold. And I don't really know what the answer to that is. I do know that there are journalists who believe this has been a very successful device and others who think otherwise. My sense, having remembered the coverage of the Vietnam War, is that the journalists have in fact sold their soul. We just recently, in the last couple of days, have seen this very large dispute about the filming of an American soldier killing an injured Iraqi. And there are many people who say this shouldn't have been broadcast. And to their credit, the broadcasters did show it. But what strikes me is we have seen many fewer examples during the coverage of the Iraq War of American soldiers being injured, of body bags and caskets, of civilians being injured by American troops than we saw in Vietnam. And I think that is a product of the embedded structures. So I think that the military and the administration, more than journalists are willing to admit, have bought a kind of tameness on the part of the coverage that is really a serious form of censorship. I mean, war is a dirty business, and we shouldn't imagine it's not a dirty business. And it's an interesting question of whether it's a good or bad thing for the public to see the horror of war. On the one hand, it might be that it will lead people to have their stomachs turn and to be more horrified than they should be, and to overreact emotionally to what they see in graphic detail of what happens in wartime, and lead them to become overly pacifist. On the other hand, if you have our nation going out and engaging in these activities, it's probably pretty important to have a real sense that it's not sanitized, that people really are being brutalized and seriously injured. Think about the coverage, for example, during this war of American soldiers who have been wounded. There are veterans hospitals that are filled with American soldiers, and the coverage of that in the media is very sporadic. Again, very different from during the Vietnam War. So whether this is partly the result of the embeddedness, partly the result of ownership, I think there are very serious problems at the moment with the concentration of ownership of the media. And that poses a real threat. One wants a robust, independent media that acts as a fifth estate, that essentially, a fourth estate, I'm sorry, that essentially feels that its responsibility is to the public and to inform and to educate the public. And I think that, and that's diverse, and that comes from every part of the political spectrum, and that is willing to engage in editorializing from widely different views of what is believed to be right or wrong. And I think that we are seeing an increased concentration of ownership of the media that leads it to be safe and relatively bland, and probably inclines it to be a bit too conservative relative to the norm. And that's a danger, because I think that there are very powerful structural changes that are happening in the press that endanger the vitality of the American democracy.
All right. Unfortunately, we are running short on time. What final thoughts would you like to leave our listeners with?
Ultimately, in a democracy, the long-term protection of our rights and our freedoms and our system depends upon the people themselves. Courts and elected officials can play a positive or a negative role in dealing with these episodes and dealing with these tendencies. But ultimately, when all is said and done, it does depend upon the people themselves to protect the nation and to protect its values. And that really requires a lot of individuals. We are still in an experiment. There's no guarantee that 20 or 50 years from now that experiment will continue to be successful. When we think about creating democracy in Iraq or Afghanistan, we know that one of the things we have to do is not just provide them with voting machines, but to provide them with a culture. And the culture that makes democracy succeed is a very complicated one. It requires intellectual independence. It requires skepticism about government officials. It requires tolerance, the willingness to lose and not pick up arms and fight over it. And that's something that needs to be constantly reaffirmed in every generation. And Americans should understand that they can't be passive about their liberties, that if they're passive about their liberties, they will ultimately lose them.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for spending time with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We have just been talking with Geoffrey Stone. He is author of Perilous Times, Free Speech in Wartime, from the Sedition Act of 1798 to the War on Terrorism.